Hello, thanks for listening. This is Jay Ritchie of Edify the Saints Ministries, edifythesaints.org. I just want to begin by saying that I'm an independent Baptist Christian, and I've done some historical research on the subject of personal liberty. I just want to say that I must be true to the Bible, I must be true to the U.S. Constitution, I must be true to history, and I must be true to myself, no matter who likes it or doesn't like it. And I ask you, the listening audience, not to judge this recording by one little snippet here, or one little snippet there, or a soundbite here, or a soundbite there, but just hear me out. Listen to this presentation in its entirety, and then come to your own conclusions. Now, this recording is by no means exhaustive, and it's not comprehensive, but I have done some research on a few of our founding fathers and a few historical Christians, and to see what they and the U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence and our founding documents have to say about liberty. Now, I know that there's probably some of you who are listening who may be tempted to be the victims of cognitive dissonance, and basically what that is just when you hear something that or you read something that goes against your long-held view, you tend to just chuck it and throw it in the trash, and tend not to think about it. You tend not to look into it more carefully because it goes against your long-held view. But what if your long-held views on liberty are not correct? And maybe this research that I've done will give you some more food for thought. As I share the truth that I've discovered, just like the Apostle Paul asked the question in Galatians 4:16, in essence, will I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? I hope not. So I hope you take the time to listen carefully, listen to this entire recording, then make your decision. And hopefully I'll give you enough information to give you food for thought, to maybe change your mind on some things you may have been wrong about. And if not, and if at the very least that I could get you to look into this subject of liberty and the historical and biblical position on liberty, in greater detail. So I just want to begin, and I want to begin with a quote from John Leland. John Leland was an influential independent Baptist preacher who worked with James Madison to include the Bill of Rights, which would guarantee civil and religious freedom for all in this country. And he, in 1790, John Leland said this: "As it is not the province of civil government to establish forms of religion, enforce a maintenance for the preachers, so it does not belong to that power to establish fixed holy days for divine worship. That the Jewish seventh-day Sabbath was of divine appointment is unquestionable, but that the Christian first-day Sabbath is of equal injunction is more doubtful. If Jesus appointed the day to be observed, he did it as the head of the church, and not as the king of nations. Or if the apostles enjoined it, they did it in the capacity of Christian teachers, and not as human legislators. As the appointment of such days is no part of human legislation, so the breach of the Sabbath, so-called, is no part of civil jurisdiction. I am not an enemy to holy days. The duties of religion cannot well be performed without fixed times, but these times should be fixed by the mutual agreement of religious societies, according to the Word of God, and not by civil authority. I see no clause in the federal Constitution or the Constitution of Virginia to empower either the federal or Virginia legislature to make any sabbatical laws," unquote. You see, John Leland was back then part of a group called the Separate Baptists or the Separatist Baptists, but now they're more formally known as Independent Baptists, I believe. They're the same. And he, although John Leland was a Baptist preacher and he certainly preached the Word of God and believed the Word of God, when it came to the civil arena, he was very careful not to mix the two. Independent Baptists were always the voice to promote and defend the separation of church and state. Just John Leland happened to be just the most vocal of his day. But the Independent Baptists we never had a history, we never had a foundation where in our history we came out of state churches. But most, if not all, of the Protestant churches, now called so-called evangelical churches today, a lot of the Protestant churches had state churches, whether over in England or even in the beginning stages of this country. They had state-funded churches and state-run churches, and they would persecute the Baptists and other people who didn't worship or acknowledge God the way that these state-run Protestant churches thought it ought to be done. And the Catholic Church back then and today was always mixed between state and church. There was always a combination. But the Independent Baptists, the Separatist Baptists, believed, as Jesus taught, that you ought to render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, but render to God that which is God. So he kept it separate. And that's what the Independent Baptists have always championed: freedom and personal liberty. Now, in 1790, John Leland again said this: government should protect every man in thinking and speaking freely, and see that one does not abuse another. So he, always believed that the government was there to protect individual liberty, as long as the liberty, as long as someone didn't use their liberty to hurt someone else or someone else's property. And then 1791, John Leland says this: these establishments, i.e. the establishment of religion by human laws, metamorphose or change the church into a creature, and religion into a principle of state, which has a natural tendency to make men conclude that Bible religion is nothing but a trick of state. And then in 1791, he says this, again, he says, quote, government has no more to do with the religious opinions of men than it has with the principles of mathematics. Let every man speak freely without fear, maintain the principles that he believes, worship according to his own faith, either one God, 3 gods, no God, or 20 gods. Let government protect him in so doing, i.e. see that he meets no personal abuse or loss of property for his religious opinions. Instead of discouraging him with proscriptions, fines, confiscations, or death, let him be encouraged as a free man to bring forth his arguments and maintain his points with all boldness. Then, if his doctrine is false, it will be confuted, and if it is true, though ever so novel, let others credit it. Unquote. Then we come to Isaac Backus. He was an Independent Baptist preacher from New England. He was a delegate to the First Continental Congress, founded Rhode Island College, later became Brown University. And he says in a sermon he entitled, "An Appeal to the Public for Religious Liberty Against the Oppressions of the Present Day," in 1773, he said, quote, "It appears to us that the true difference in exact limits between ecclesiastical and civil government is this: that the church is armed with light and truth to pull down the strongholds of iniquity, and to gain souls to Christ and into his church, to be governed by his rules therein, and again to exclude such from their communion, who will not be so governed, while the state is armed with the sword to guard the peace and the civil rights of all persons and societies, and to punish those who violate the same. And then again, in the same sermon, he says, now, who can hear Christ declare that his kingdom is not of this world, and yet believe that this blending of church and state together can be pleasing to him? Very powerful question there that many Christians and conservatives need to think about. And then Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence and the third president of the United States, in the following letter dated January 23, 1808, to Samuel Miller, a Presbyterian minister, Thomas Jefferson took the opportunity to defend his point of view, which he felt was strongly supported by the Constitution. And Jefferson goes on to say this, quote, I consider the government of the United States as interdicted, which means prohibited, by the Constitution from intermeddling with religious institutions, their doctrines, discipline, or exercises. This results not only from the provision that no law shall be made respecting the establishment or free exercise of religion, but from that also which reserves to the states the powers not delegated to the U.S. Certainly, no power to prescribe any religious exercise or to assume authority in religious discipline has been delegated to the general government, unquote. And so, just to go back and just look at this statement again, he says, I consider the government of the United States as interdicted or prohibited by the Constitution from intermeddling with religious institutions, their doctrines, and the discipline and exercises. Then he says, this results not only from the provision that no law shall be made respecting the establishment or free exercise of religion. And many of you may not like what I'm going to talk about in this recording, but just hear me out. And but I want you to understand that defining marriage, and I'm speaking to Christians primarily here, and other conservatives that I believe are sincere, but they're sincerely misguided. Defining marriage as a union of one man and one woman is an exercise of religion, as God is the one who ordained marriage before any human government was instituted. And therefore, Thomas Jefferson is saying that the government of the United States is prohibited from intermeddling with religious definitions, which would, because marriage is a doctrine of Christianity. It's an institution of Christianity found in the Bible. And Thomas Jefferson, and I agree with him, he says that the government is prohibited from getting involved. And then defining marriage as the biblical definition of one man and one woman is a religious exercise. And so therefore, for Christians to petition the government to get the government to define marriage the way they want it defined, the government is prohibited by the Constitution from doing that. And therefore, Christians have no constitutional right to get the government involved with something that is a private religious institution and private religious doctrine and private religious exercise. Then Thomas Jefferson goes on to say in his memoirs, Correspondence and Private Papers, he says, quote, I do not believe it is for the interest of religion to invite the civil magistrate to direct its exercises, its discipline, or its doctrines. And that is exactly what Christians are doing when they try to get the government involved